Hi, I'm Jeff Nyquist, and here with me is my co-host Alex Benesch in Germany. I'm in the United States. This is Friends and Enemies, and we are now on part three of the Cold War and going through 20th century conflicts. And we're going to discuss, the end of the 50s and the 1960s, some of the more important events. We can't cover it all in this episode, but we want to focus this time on the Kennedy assassination, the Gallitzin defection, and of course the aftermath of those things and how they worked. Of course, we're going to have to talk about the lead in to this, the Berlin crisis under Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, which also ties into what we talked about last time about the overthrowing of Diem in Vietnam. And of course, it all ties into the Kennedy assassination. So Alex has some opening remarks here about the 1960s. Alex, take it away.
All right. So, as I see it, the 1960s was truly a make or break time, as well as for the West, especially Western intelligence, but especially for communist intelligence, because at a very early stage of communism, the communists figured out that their system couldn't work. Eventually, they would have to publicly abandon communism, and they also wanted to be able to talk to the right wing worldwide, not just to the left wing. So that was something that they had planned. The other thing was the staged, phony split, the fake split between Russia and China. That was a deception operation that was intensified during the 1960s. It was absolutely crucial to maintain these two strategic deceptions while infiltrating the West harder and harder. So these secrets had to be protected at all costs. These deceptions had to be shielded, especially during the 60s, because we know ultimately after Kennedy died and Johnson was done, we finally had Nixon, and Nixon ultimately fell for it. He fell for the fake split in the communist camp. That was then, the later decade, 1971. Nixon decides, on the advice of Henry Kissinger, of course, to play nice with the Chinese in order to weaken the USSR. So they bought the lie that was built up during the 1960s. And so a lot was going on in the 60s. We saw some of the most important defectors from the Soviet Union. We also saw a bunch of fake defectors, and this created sort of this chaos that somebody like James Angleton at the CIA had to deal with. That was a monumental task to filter out what information was good, what defector was good, and these questions that Angleton was, and others like Bagley and more people, these questions they were wrestling with. How big is our infiltration problem? How many moles do we really have? Do we really have a huge problem or not? And the other thing was, could there be more grand deception from the communists, maybe with the Chinese or maybe some long-term strategies? This all happened in the 60s, and the communists tried their hardest to infiltrate Western anti-communist circles. They tried to control their own opposition.
I might mention just about because it's a perfect time to mention this, that there were two big developments in the latter 1950s. Is that you had Sputnik, which was the first satellite, which was really the first ICBM, because if you could put something into orbit, you can make something that just goes shy of orbit and can fly through space and land in another country and deliver a hydrogen bomb warhead, because the hydrogen bomb was being developed. And these ICBM technology, which meant that in 30 minutes, you could land a rocket on the United States from Russia and vice versa. And both in the United States and in the Soviet Union, you had strategists getting together and trying to think, what does this mean? So this kind of is the preamble, both in terms of intelligence. And what happened is in 1956, right after Khrushchev denounced Stalin, and is probably part of the strategy, you had Leonid Brezhnev being put in charge of a committee, which I call it the Brezhnev Committee, where you had, and we talked about this in previous episodes, where you've got people like Nikolai Mironov, the KGB general who believed in Sun Tzu, and you've got Vity Sokolovsky, the marshal of the Soviet Union who believed in Clausewitz, sort of marrying the two concepts to make this grand strategy, both using deception by the KGB and preparation for massive nuclear war by the Soviet Army. And of course, at the same time in the United States, Eisenhower has the Gaither Commission, which is looking at the exact same thing to change American strategy. And the Gaither Commission, though, was mostly rejected because it said we have to have anti-communist education for our high school kids. We have to, we can't build so many freeways because we need the concrete to build bomb shelters so our people can survive a nuclear war. This was rejected by Eisenhower. What was accepted was ICBMs in silos underground, bombers on alert, flying around ready to go. That was accepted, but the more socially deeper things Eisenhower rejected. He thought that Eisenhower, being a liberal Republican, thought that was fascism and thought he did not fight World War II to make America then fascist and opposing communism. So this is the prequel to this. And of course, in the Soviet Union, they reorganized the KGB. In 19, they made Alexander Shelepin. Ivan Serov was moved out as head of the KGB and made head of the GRU. And Shelepin was brought in to do this deception thing. And this was all Khrushchev's doing. And of course, they reorganized the KGB to keep the secret of the master deception, the monster plot, as mockingly Golitsyn's information. It was Golitsyn who was in some of these early meetings and planning sessions under Shelepin, where they talked about the fake split with China. And Golitsyn heard a lecture by Shelepin about this in 1959, I believe it was, a year before the split. And they also talked about having a new Operation Trust, where the Soviet Union seemed to go away. And so he saw the inklings of the organization for this, where they created an inner and an outer KGB, where no one in it would know what the plan was. So if they defected, they couldn't reveal anything. And an inner KGB of people who were closely guarded within the Soviet Union would not ever be allowed to get out and tell the secret. And that's my preamble to the 60s. This is where then you get Kennedy beats Nixon in the 1960 presidential election. And now you've got a Democratic administration where the Democratic Party was the one that was more infiltrated by the communists all along. And then so sorry, go ahead.
No, this is exactly the situation that America was then in, because people who in America who got sort of Americans who got sort of closer to the truth, these Americans saw their careers ruined, like Angleton, Bagley at the CIA, and others. You had the
Otto Otepka at the State Department was harassed. They moved him around and shuffled him. He kept his federal job, but he was just illegally besieged.
And even the files that had been accumulated by Angleton and his division, these files were shredded. So this was it was described as deleting the memory. A key aspect of the CIA's memory was just deleted. So anything that would get people closer to these grander operations of the communists, all of this was torpedoed. And you saw the strange end of Senator Joseph McCarthy. Then people that died strangely under strange circumstances, like Patton. So there must have been a grand effort to not just infiltrate the Western circles, the Western anti-communists, not just infiltrate and misdirect, but also to discredit specific ideas, discredit specific people, and maybe even take out some people if they can't be removed.
There's even been questions about, for example, George Orwell, that supposedly he was being treated in a clinic for tuberculosis and he was supposedly cured. And when his fiancée came to get him, I'm sorry, he died.
Yeah.
Right.
And so the Kennedys
Joseph McCarthy goes into the hospital with a bum knee and doesn't leave. He dies of liver failure.
Yeah.
So these are things people have raised. I mean, they might have died of natural causes, but these questions have been raised. Were these people poisoned? Maybe.
Yeah, and also the Kennedys. The Kennedys were close to Senator McCarthy. The Kennedys, they had sort of they looked like Democrats to a degree, but they were really, really anti-Soviet. So they were a problem in and of
Very
itself for
much.
the Soviet
Yeah.
Union.
Yeah. I comment about the Kennedys. I should mention that Joseph McCarthy spent weekends with the Kennedys, even though he was a Republican. See, they were all Irish Catholic, and Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy were very anti-communist. Unlike a lot of the Democratic Party with its New Dealers, had this strong left wing, and the Kennedys. But you see, John Kennedy wanted to be president, and this is what happened: is that they had to woo the left of the Democratic Party for John Kennedy to be the candidate in 1960.
Yeah.
And he had enemies within the Democratic Party, but he had to make them into allies. This is where he gets a lot of these people coming into his administration that are questionable. And I think a number of them, like Walt Rostow, for example, would present themselves to the Kennedys as hawks, because the Kennedys were hawks. But they were really very left in their orientation.
Yeah, and some of these reports, especially CIA reports, CIA debriefings about very, very important Soviet defectors, especially in the early 60s. Some of these reports and debriefings were so important, they ended up in the president's briefing. And this was something that John F. Kennedy was getting into, and when the assassination happened, then his brother, of course, got even more interested in some of these defectors, and there were some meetings, and there was kind of a larger interest about the question of, are there bigger plots by the communists? Do we have to look for something bigger? And this was also always the game of McCarthy. He was always looking for bigger operations, a larger dimension of the problem. And so these people were specifically targeted by the communists, not just with propaganda, but also with other operations, because some anti-communists had to be taken out. Because
others needed to be taken over.
Yeah, and because you couldn't fool everybody. I mean, you could fool ultimately Nixon, and you could fool people in the intelligence community by spreading all this fake stuff about, Mao hating Stalin, Stalin hating Mao, and they want to go to war over there, and all this stuff. So some people got fooled, but some people didn't get fooled, and those who didn't get fooled, they ended up dead, or their careers were ended, like with Angleton. And we can. If you eliminate the false leads about the Kennedy assassination, the false sensations, you are left with an evil communist man, Lee Harvey Oswald, who had spent time in the USSR, who had 8 seconds, more than enough time to fire his shots at the president at the right moment. It would have been cheap and easy for the KGB to recruit him in the USSR, and we cannot rely just on the released KGB file on Oswald and his personal diary. And so this was sort of something that we've seen over and over again. Every time something dramatic happens, 9/11, Kennedy assassination, this, that. Somebody else got shot. It's always the same. The claim that the CIA did it, the Jewish world conspiracy did it, generally the right wingers did it. It's always the same thing, and then they start shooting all kinds of stuff in all directions.
Massive,
yeah. Until people lose track of the facts, they forget what was actually a fact and what was a logical thought, and because they are so busy with everything else.
They're so busy. Let's look at the Kennedys for a second and look at the Bay of Pigs because we didn't cover some of these things. The Berlin crisis, because one of the things about Kennedy when he first comes into office is that Khrushchev has been absolutely anxious to take Berlin, because you've got East and West Germany, but West Berlin is an island controlled by the West, attached to Berlin, because just as Germany was divided into these occupation zones, the British, the American, the French, the Soviet, the Berlin was divided into these zones. And of course, this island of the West in the middle of East Germany was not wanted. And Khrushchev did not want to attack it when Eisenhower was president. And the reason was John Foster Dulles died, I think it was of cancer. John Foster Dulles was the Secretary of State. And when he died, Eisenhower started to, although he replaced the Secretary of State, he started watching the foreign policy thing himself. And Eisenhower was a general. And of course, as we mentioned last time, Eisenhower's whole approach to the Soviet Union was, well, if they want a war, we'll give them a big one. We will just go for World War III if they mess with us. So that Eisenhower had spooked the communists into being more quiet in this period. So Eisenhower was just was in the way. But as soon as Eisenhower was gone, Khrushchev saw Kennedy as this younger playboy, as a not serious person, and he thought, oh, this guy, I'm going to roll him and I'm going to take Berlin. So this is what Khrushchev tries to do. And of course, Kennedy stands up to him and he has to put up the Berlin Wall, right? Yeah. And this is embarrassing.
61, the wall was built in
61. And it's embarrassing to Khrushchev. And Khrushchev, according to Ion Pacepa, who was working and he'd worked in the German station of the Romanian foreign intelligence, he knew all this because Khrushchev had vacationed just before Kennedy became president. Khrushchev had vacationed in Romania for a period of weeks. It was like the longest vacation Khrushchev took. And of course, the Romanians were working in Germany together with the Soviets on these projects. And so Pacepa saw that. So then the president of Romania goes to vacation in the Soviet Union with Khrushchev after the Berlin crisis, comes back and he tells his heads of intelligence, and Pacepa found out about this. He said, that crazy Khrushchev wants to kill Kennedy, right?
Oh no.
Yes. And so then so Pacepa's pretty convinced, and that's why he wrote his book, Program to Kill. Pacepa's pretty convinced that Khrushchev is ultimately behind this because Khrushchev hated him. And then, of course, you had the Bay of Pigs where Kennedy's embarrassed, and the CIA very much embarrassed Kennedy in that. And the Kennedy brothers got really deeply into micromanaging Bobby Kennedy, especially the CIA. And then they had all these attempts to assassinate Castro. But the main attempt, and this is what opened the door to their assassination, they had found this Brazilian who had been in with Castro, had been part of the Castro regime, to hire him and give him a rifle with a telescopic sight to shoot Castro. And it was after the CIA met with this guy, and they were going to meet with him, like I think the day that Kennedy was shot in November 22nd in Paris, November 22nd, 1963, this same Brazilian, about killing him. But Castro found out because and it's basically a lot of people who look at this think that this Brazilian basically leaked it right away to Castro. Look, they are hiring me to kill you with a telescopic rifle. And you can look on YouTube, you can find this, and it's in the documentary that I had you watch. I recommend to everybody. Yeah, if you could maybe put that on a link to that on this.
Sure.
So people can watch this excellent. It's on YouTube. But there's footage. You can look it up on YouTube of Castro going to the Brazilian embassy and saying, hey, you Colombian, this Colombian AP reporter, and then getting it on camera saying, the Kennedy brothers want to kill me, and I want you to know it's a two-way street. It can go back on them.
Exactly.
And this was I think it was late September of 1963. This is weeks before Dallas, right? So this is really undeniable. This isn't just something invented. And then, and there's a lot more connecting this. And
wouldn't it be so smart? Wouldn't it have been smart, for the Russians to heavily involve the Cubans in this assassination? Because if something happened and this went sideways and something got leaked, the blame would be on the Cubans, and the Russians could have said, we didn't order that. If
Right.
this is
You got to have
problem,
layers.
you have a problem.
Right. You got to have layers
yeah.
of deniability.
You
Yes.
have a problem with the Cubans, not with us. We didn't do that.
Yeah.
So it's like this was a documentary. People can find it on YouTube. You have to type in the name of the documentary. This is Rendezvous with Death, and you should also maybe add search terms like JFK and the name Huisman. This is Huisma, I think a double N. Huisman.
Yes, it is double N.
Because
yeah.
I think it's on his personal channel in full length, because this was made by the WDR media house in Germany. This was Western German state media. This was initially set up as under the occupation after World War II. So there's an anti-communist professional underlying quality to it, to this documentary, and some of this these media houses here were started by the Americans, and some of the German media got infiltrated by the Russians, though, like the NDR, which is not the WDR. Because the NDR, they put out some seriously gross stuff over the last years. But there's also some professionals. So people can find this documentary, Rendezvous with Death. And it's like, there's actually new material. And there's this really stunning stuff in it.
It's incredible, because what they have is an elderly Cuban intelligence officer who was involved in the assassination plot. And he had the details. Marina Oswald was a KGB agent. Oswald was the whole setup of the assassination, that the KGB handed Oswald over to the DGI to be an assassin, to work on this thing, and who he met with in Mexico City. And of course, they actually briefly get access to Mexican secret police files. They actually open them up, and they get to, but then somebody must have found out, and they quickly closed them so they couldn't see everything, but they saw enough to validate what the thesis was. And of course, this whole story, there's a reason for the CIA and the FBI to cover up this story of Russian and Cuban involvement in the assassination, because it was such an emotional event. I was 5 years old when Kennedy was assassinated, but you had to know it was so emotional for Americans. The way Kennedy was killed, the horrible way he was killed, that if they had been clearly tied to Moscow and Havana, it would have been like the death of Archduke Francis Ferdinand. It would have been World War III. Why? Because we almost had World War III the year before, in October 1962. And people don't fully understand how serious this Soviet move was. Khrushchev and his buddies decided they were going to put intermediate range nuclear missiles and also tactical nuclear weapons and an entire Soviet army of 50,000 men into Cuba.
Yeah,
and that army with tactical nuclear weapons.
We should mention that some of these nuclear weapons can be moved quite quickly all around Cuba. So it wasn't just fixed silos, fixed launching stations that the Americans could target, but you could actually move them around every day if they had to. So they're harder to hit. So and if you have
of course the Russians are experts at camouflage. Maskirovka is a Russian military term, which is a combination of camouflage and psychological obfuscation, right? And so it was. So what happened was, the Americans didn't even know that 50,000 Soviet troops had been moved to the Western Hemisphere. Imagine it, a Soviet army. Four full divisions of the Soviet army moved into Cuba, along with a tactical reinforcement. And the local commander of this Soviet army was given carte blanche to use his nuclear weapons if he was threatened, without having to ask permission from Moscow, which is amazing. So Khrushchev was
but it's also plausible deniability,
chance.
Right? This is also plausible deniability, because it's like it could always be claimed, if this all goes wrong, could also be claimed, well, this particular commander, he was like in the movie Dr. Strangelove, right? The Kubrick movie Dr. Strangelove, where this one commander makes this decision on his own.
Right. He did it without our permission.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. He was
He
acting
went
on
off.
his own
He went
behalf.
off half-cocked. Yeah,
So by
and
international law, we didn't start a war. He did. It's just, and he wasn't
no, and
working
of
for us
course,
anymore. And
Castro's role in all this. Castro wanted a nuclear war. From all that we can tell, he was very excited by all of this, by the idea of destroying the United States and freeing everybody from American imperialism. And of course, what ended up happening was Americans didn't detect these shipments of troops and equipment, but U-2 was our spy plane back
plane.
then, that super high altitude spy plane that used the special cameras to take pictures. And what they found is they found the missiles being pulled off the ships, being assembled, being put together on the ground in Cuba. These are missile sites. They're being put together. These are nuclear intermediate range missiles. In other words, they could hit Chicago and Washington from Cuba. They didn't have to be ICBMs. And this was a way to put America in a tremendous, because America, unlike Russia was already beginning to build its blast and
Defense.
fallout shelter system.
Yeah.
And so this was very frightening because Americans had lived with the total idea of their invulnerability till then, because there were very few ICBMs yet comparatively on each side. And this really put America under the gun. And of course, when those it was funny, Andrei Gromyko, who was the Soviet foreign minister, had gone to the White House. And Kennedy had asked him, what's going on down in Cuba? What are you doing? And he promised Kennedy there was no monkey business in Cuba. We're not putting missiles down. And so here Kennedy had the pictures, and there was Andrei Gromyko lying to his face about this, which is what the Soviets do.
Yeah, I'd like to remember people, that in the 60s and then especially in the 70s as well, we had in Germany, Western Germany, we had an assassination campaign run by communists. So this was quite a big operation when these true believers, these cult-like communists, coming from backgrounds not too different from Oswald's background, these people started to kidnap government officials, high-ranking people, just shooting them up on the street, assassinating them, kidnapping them, holding mock trials. So this was not too different from, let's say the Kennedy assassination. I mean, of course, the Kennedy assassination had a much, much bigger effect, and this was kind of another dimension of this, but all in all, this was a common thing in the 60s and 70s.
Well, yeah,
internationally,
Khrushchev,
to have this was the 1966 conference in Havana, Cuba, where all these communists met from different countries and they devised this terrorism strategy. Wasn't this was it 66? The Havana conference?
That could be right. I'm not remembering exactly when, but they have these meetings from time to time, all the time. And of course, Cuba, they hosted the non-aligned movements supposedly. But as far as
Carlos
these campaign
the Jackal, Carlos the Jackal,
right, the Venezuelan.
The RAF, some of the Muslim guys, the PLO, this was all a bigger campaign, global campaign of terrorism and killing people. People from large corporations, government people. This was normal to them. So why should we treat the Kennedy assassination in any
different?
Yeah,
right. Well, it's interesting that Khrushchev supposedly, one of the things when Khrushchev criticized and denounced Stalin in 1956, I think, what was it, October 56, Khrushchev said that the problem with Stalin was that he had his own people assassinated. Now, we know that Putin does that now. But he said, we need to turn our assassination mechanism out. We need to assassinate people, in the capitalist world. We need to focus on that. And of course, what you're saying is exactly right. Terrorism and assassination. And a good example is Bogdan Stashinsky, who was a Department 13, was the assassinations department of the KGB. And they said, look, we want you to marry, and this applies to Oswald too, because Pachepa thinks that Oswald was a Department 13 assassin. Stashinsky was told to marry this KGB agent to be his helpmate. He didn't want to. He refused. And because they liked him so much, they let him marry the woman he wanted, who ultimately talked him into defecting. But he murdered 2 Ukrainians in Germany because there was a Ukrainian diaspora in Germany that was opposed to the communist regime. And Khrushchev wanted to get rid of these Ukrainian activists and leaders. And, Stepan Bandera was murdered, right, in Germany. And of course, Stashinsky turned himself in, and I think it was 1962, it was revealed, Stashinsky said, Khrushchev ordered me to kill these people, right? Yeah. So this revealed Khrushchev as a master of assassins just the year before Kennedy was killed. So you had, and of course, what happened with Khrushchev's Cuban Missile Crisis is Kennedy put the blockade on this, and here this whole Soviet army and these missiles are blockaded. Yeah, he didn't blink. Now we gave up missiles in Turkey, and people criticize that, and some people say we gave up the Monroe Doctrine because we said, look, remove the missiles, remove the troops. We won't invade. Of course, the Kennedys were planning to go after Cuba anyway.
And I need to mention something that it's not just specific to Western Germany, but this is also important to Americans. Okay, so in I think it was 1956. This is when the Communist Party, the Communist Party of West Germany was officially banned. The party was ended. They lost the money that they had in the official accounts, and the whole party was done. And so the highest court, the constitutional court, had to give its opinion on why it was perfectly legal and appropriate to ban a political party. And I recently pulled this up because it's relevant to the right-wing parties nowadays, because they could be banned with the same argument, foreign entanglement with the Russians and the Chinese and all that stuff. So I pulled this old this old text from that judgment, from the Constitutional Court to ban the Communist Party. And one core argument to ban the party was these communists are in bed with Moscow and Beijing. That's one. The other thing was these communists, for a long time, they had essentially told the world what their plans are to some degree, and to a large degree what their strategies are. So by constantly talking about Marxism, Leninism, and the revolutionary way to win, and how we're going to take over this, and then we may use violence, or we just use violence later.
Unrestricted warfare, basically. Yes. It's not anything new.
Even when they take power by propaganda and elections, they would use violence later. They said this in their own words for decades, and so all the court had to do was quote them with their own words and say that's their strategy. They want violence. They consider violence. They have no trouble with violence. So we're just gonna end this party. And so this is what's so amazing, that all this Marxist Leninist propaganda worldwide influenced people like Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald was reading this stuff when he was a teenager, and he hated America, he hated everything, and he found his new religion in communism. So this was basically, Marxism, Leninism is like a manual to turn into a terrorist revolutionary anyway. So this was a whole big semi-legal and illegal program worldwide to teach people to become, to turn into Lee Harvey Oswalds and to start killing, people. So this is
there's three main ways
of Oswald.
Yeah, there's three main ways for the communists to recruit an agent, and ideological recruitment is one of those three ways. The other ways are blackmail and, of course,
money,
bribery, paying people money. But those are the three main avenues. And Oswald obviously was ideologically motivated to work for the KGB and the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. He was an admirer of Castro. He wanted to live in the Soviet Union, and then he wanted to live in communist Cuba. And of course, he had a Russian wife. And of course, we mentioned, the things about Marina Oswald, I think are worth mentioning. She had a Leningrad accent, but claimed to be born in a small village up by Archangel.
Mm-hmm.
She claimed she didn't know her father's first name, but yet and claimed that she was adopted by her uncle Sasha, right?
Yeah, and her
Sasha's
mother
Alexander,
died, so
but
you can't track her down. The mother
she
is
can't track her
gone.
mother either, right?
Yeah.
So what's interesting though is she's Marina Nikolaevich is her name, which means her father's not Alexander. It's Nikolai is her father. So she did know her father's name. So it's all they didn't, the details in her legend. And this is what Pachepa says, is that Marina Oswald is obviously,
Mm-hmm.
according to Pachepa, Marina Oswald is obviously fits all the markers of a
Yeah.
wife KGB agent assigned to Oswald.
And if we do this mental experiment, if the KGB had not recruited Oswald in the USSR and had not recruited Marina and made them marry and go to the United States, if the KGB had not done that, they would have been complete idiots, and they were not idiots. It would have been the very unprofessional thing. This would be against standard procedures. This would be completely against the logic of the KGB. And so you recommended this one book to me, and I read it before this episode. And this is the book called Case Closed. It's a very good book because it's so methodical in weeding out the garbage. Because for so long there have been sensationalist books, and they've chased all gone through all these rabbit holes, and they were clinging to something that somebody misremembered, and then they construed this into a larger thing, and they were opening up so many possible alleys. But once you systematically erase the nonsense, you go through the source material again, you double check, you triple check. This is what the author had done. And when you eliminate the nonsense, you are left with an evil man, a communist, a very staunch communist, who had enough opportunity and time to shoot the president. And so the only criticism that you and I have when it comes to this book is the author isn't really that deep into this whole espionage thing. So he's not really too familiar with the KGB. He tries to be thorough, so he's interpreting this whole Oswald fiasco with the help of Oswald's own diary. With the help of the official KGB file on Oswald, and also he's relying on what the phony defector Nozenko said about Oswald.
He very much takes that side.
Because Nozenko claimed that for people that don't know, Nozenko was a defector. And he claimed that he was responsible for that specific unit in the KGB. He
claimed that he had. Yeah, he claimed he had Oswald's file.
Yeah.
Because he had Oswald's file.
Because he would be responsible for every tourist that comes into the Soviet Union to check them out. Because they had this thing called Intourist. So if you said, I want a vacation, or I want to, visit the Soviet Union for studies or art or whatever, you would treat it like a tourist, but the KGB would be on you the moment you landed, basically. And so Nozenko said that, my unit was responsible for Oswald when he came to the Soviet Union, because he said he loved the Soviet Union, but we had zero interest in him. He was stupid, and he tried to commit suicide to get to stay in the Soviet Union, and we didn't like him, and we just wanted to ship him back home. But, because of political reasons, and I'll get to that in a bit. Because of political reasons, we thought it wouldn't look good if we wrestled this young American onto a plane, somebody who had attempted suicide once. Wouldn't have been good optics, to force him onto a plane or have him, bleed out on the way to the plane. So we decided to, give him his temporary visa to stay in the Soviet Union. So this is what Nozenko said to the CIA, that we had zero interest in Oswald and we never tried to recruit him. We looked at him when we put him in Minsk, but we never recruited him because we thought he was meaningless and stupid. But when you read that in the book, when you read that analysis in the book, this is not really how the KGB was thinking. Because if there is an American on your soil, sure, you can recruit him and you can work with him. You can test him if he's capable. You can figure out his personality. You can test his loyalty. Is he able to commit violence? You can safely test this on your home turf. And then you can make a decision what to do with him next. You could also get another KGB asset, Marina. You get another KGB asset and you marry these two and then send them back to America. So your second asset, Marina, also gets American citizenship. Now, an American passport was really valuable to Soviet intelligence. So now you have two assets on American soil. And because she was pregnant, these KGB sleeper agents, they were at some point required or pressured into recruiting their own children, because they were all phony marriages. These were just two KGB agents married to each other or fake married to each other. And when they had children, they were expected to recruit their own children for the KGB. So potentially you get three assets for the price of one, right? So why wouldn't the KGB try this? This is something that when you read that book, Case Closed, you have to go deeper when it comes to the KGB.
A note on all the conspiracy theories, and people just love to believe that somebody other than the communists were behind Kennedy's, or a communist was behind Kennedy's death. They just love it. The FBI, this is mind-boggling, the FBI interviewed 25,000 people regarding the Kennedy assassination, and they produced a report of 25,000 pages, and that is just the FBI's part in it.
There's millions of pages now.
The volume, the Warren Commission interviewed, I think, over 500 people. The 7 members only interviewed, I think, 55, but so over 500 people were examined. And of course, any human endeavor involving such a huge number of people and witnesses, you're going to have errors of interpretation in the reports. You're going to have witnesses contradicting each other, saying all kinds of things, like the Parkland doctors, right? There were 8 Parkland doctors that examined Kennedy. Well, here his head is all bloody. He's got a lot of hair. They didn't really examine the entry and exit wounds, although one of the doctors did see them. So you've got doctors that start to say, oh no, he was shot from the front or whatever. You have these contradictions. Well, they're not pathologists, right? They're not doing their expertise is not an autopsy.
By the way, when
right?
it comes to the physicalities of the effects of the shooting, nowadays, we have computerized reconstructions of what happened. So there was no magic bullet.
And the Zapruder film was run through these computer simulations.
So you actually got a better sense of timing when you analyze the Zapruder film with modern technology. So now you figured out Oswald had at least 8 seconds to make these shots. Possibly
8.4 seconds.
Not 4 seconds. Yeah. He had at least 8 seconds, which was enough. And so there was no magic bullet. You can now reconstruct it with computer precision what actually happened that day. And also, anybody can go on YouTube these days and watch some of these ballistics channels where they will take a modern type of ballistic gel, and they take a human skull or a plastic representation of a human skull, or sometimes they use real bones, and they actually put these bones and other elements in a mold, and then they add this ballistic gel to the mold to create sort of a realistic behaving dummy. Okay, there are ballistics channels on YouTube, and they will fire different calibers at these very expensive, sophisticated dummies. And so they shoot the heads, they shoot the torso, they shoot all kinds of parts, and they film that with a what they call a high-speed camera, meaning it shoots many, many frames per second. So then you can watch it in ultra slow motion in detail. And so when they're blasting these dummies from different directions, you can see how the energy of that bullet actually impacts the target. And it's impossible to say afterwards, well, this must have come from that angle, just because of the injuries. Right. It's not that simple, because, all this all this energy just works its way
Well,
through the target.
they actually, four of the Parkland doctors went to see the X-rays and to recall what they did in I think it was 1988. And they basically confirmed this is what they saw. This is what happened. The entry wound was in the upper back part of the head. The entry wound is the small wound, right? And the exit wound is the big wound. So it comes out here and it pops out here, right? And when it comes out, I mean, 70% of the presidents, this is terrible, were blown out of his head, 70% of his brains, right? And so you have this, it's a lethal wound. It's what killed the president. And you have bits of bone fragment and things. That is the exit wound, not the entry wound, right?
Yeah.
And so this is very clear. And in the Zapruder film, these computer analysis, Kennedy's head, people say it's impossible because his head flies backwards.
It's not impossible.
Why. His head is initially, when they analyzed it, there are frames which you can't see where his head is driven forward by the bullet. But when the brain is impacted, all of the muscles in the back are all stiffened, which cause the body to go like this and the head to go back. All the nerves are getting this signal to throw everything back.
Exactly. There's a footnote, because I read all the footnotes in the book, Case Closed, because they're so extensive, and most of the stuff should have been in the actual text of the book itself, because it's that important.
Yes.
But he put some of that important stuff in the footnotes, so I would recommend to people they read the footnotes. And he has one in there, and he says that he actually saw a video from some operation. This was something, I don't exactly, this is some government people. They showed him a video of an execution, right?
Yes. And so, a person who was executed, yes.
Yeah, so this person was shot in the head from one direction.
From behind.
But the body, or the human didn't act like the conspiracy buffs think it would act. Sometimes it's contradictory to what you expect, because you don't have the experience when it comes to these sort of injuries and shootings.
That's
and
right.
Also, the Zapruder film was shot on the Zapruder film was not shot in 25 frames per second or 30 frames per second or more frames per second. I think it was 18 frames per second. So nowadays when you watch it on YouTube, it's actually been interpolated to be 60 frames per second. And your graphics card and your monitor, they may even create more frames that were not there before. So it's just the algorithm guessing what's between frame number 17 and frame number 18. The algorithm just guesses based on these two frames, and it guesses what's in the middle. It's called interpolating. So it's not even a perfect representation of the actual event. Even the original film material was not a perfect representation of what happened. It's just a flawed recording that you have to then, analyze further to make sense of it. And so there was we got all this modern evidence now, all these modern tools nowadays, and it was such a big deal in the movie by Oliver Stone, who's now a very big supporter of the Putin regime. He always claimed to be the good guy. He made these movies like Platoon and all this stuff, and he always wanted to be the rebel, the good guy, the leftist. But now he's a Putin fan, and so in this movie JFK, it's kind of the centerpiece, one of the centerpieces of the movie, back and to the left. Look at the Zapruder film. The head goes back and to the left, so the shot must have been shot must have come from the front and not the back. School book depository. It's nonsense. It doesn't tell us anything. What the movie is presenting there, and this bit where you see Kennedy jerking, and also I might add that these bullets. Now, the rifle that was used, the caliber that was used, this projectile flies at a very specific speed, a very high speed, has a lot of energy, And so
And it tumbles, the bullet tumbles.
Yeah, so we're talking about what is it in meters per second? So it's like more than 1,000
It's
meters.
It's 2,000 meters
per second,
something
so,
like that.
Yeah, so when you have a shorter distance, and you fire these shots and they hit the target, the actual impact, this happens so fast. It's even it could be even faster than what the film camera, the Zapruder film camera, can actually capture. Because if you only have 18 frames per second, but something is faster than one frame to the next, you have a problem. The film is not a perfect representation of what happened. And so now when you watch it on your computer screen, the Zapruder film, and you see this super quick jerking motion, this has all kinds of digital interpolation in it. It's not reality. It's just a flawed recording of what happened. So you cannot just base your whole case on that stuff. And, the book, Case Closed, it goes into all of the witness accounts and what they thought they saw, what they may have heard. And a lot of this stuff was just guesswork. These people thought, was it 2 shots, 3 shots? Was it, how many shots was it? And did it come from this direction?
I should correct what I just said. It's the bullet's 2,000 miles an hour, but I don't know what it is in meters.
It
might be 500.
I think a handgun bullet is 300 meters a second, and I think a rifle bullet is 1,000 meters a second or more. Because you have to imagine, if a sniper does a shot, sometimes the bullet will need a second or more to hit a target, and so the target can be 1,000 yards away.
And of course, then there's this whole idea that Oswald was a patsy, and this is where we get into. And there's a book that came out last year, and I read because I wrote a series on the Kennedy assassination last summer, and this is the Oswalds. And this is written by Paul R. Gregory. He was an economics professor at Harvard who spent the summer of 1962 with the Oswalds and really helped them. And his family was from the white Russian diaspora. They were Russians who were opposed to communism. And here was this couple coming to the fort. They initially came to Fort Worth before he worked in Dallas. And so they tried to help her learn English. He was giving her English lessons and so on. And so he got to know the Oswalds, Lee and Marina. And it's very interesting. He is of no doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald killed Kennedy because of what he knew about him personally, what he knew about his character and his personality, and what he knew because when Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for this, he and his father went to help Marina, and they were there and his father helped to translate for the Treasury Department, for the Secret Service guys and the FBI guys, what Marina had to say. And so they got to see how Marina behaved, and they actually went, when Marina went to the jail to see Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald, the one time she went, he reports in there that she left knowing he had shot the president. She was not of any doubt. Although today she pretends that she now thinks he didn't shoot Kennedy, right?
Yeah, but before the Kennedy assassination, Oswald almost killed a general who was running for
General Walker
for governor of Texas. This was a guy. He was strongly anti-communist. He was, I think, attached to the Birch Society and
a local Birch leader. Yeah.
So all that stuff, and so there was a preparation phase where Oswald would do reconnaissance first, finding a good place to make the shot, and figuring out when the general will be home. And he had set it all up, and he had his preparations at home. Some of the preparations even got noticed by people, and he ultimately...
he left instructions when he went out to shoot Walker. He left instructions for his wife of what she was to do, how she would try to go to the Soviet embassy to get back home with their child if he got caught.
He almost hit the guy. He almost made the shot. This was like the bullet was just I think deflected a tiny
Walker
little bit.
moved his head. Walker moved his head at the last minute, and it didn't hit him.
Yeah, and it almost
You know?
did. This was almost
Yeah.
like the alternate version of history, where Oswald killed the potential next governor of Texas. But then it became Kennedy. So maybe he could have done both. Maybe he could have done more people.
If yes, exactly. I mean, he was sent there as a department. Now, Department 13. Why do we say that Oswald worked for KGB Department 13? And this is another thing we found. They found in his papers, where he admits, they have it in his own writing. Oswald went to Mexico City in late September 1963, and he met with Valery Kostikov, who went by the name of Kostin. Oswald entered Mexico, by the way, under a false name. So they set up some kind of meeting, possibly at a bullfight. Okay, and there were meetings, and Kostikov was identified by the CIA as a Department 13. That's the assassinations department of the KGB, as being an officer of that department.
Oh, and by the way, it's just so people do not forget about this, because I have my notes here about Oswald and the events in chronological order. But when he was a teenager, as a teenager, he got himself into communist literature. That's been proven over and over again. There was like one or two voices that denied this. Of course, you always get some of those people, but we have multiple confirmations that people saw this literature lying around when he was a teenager. Later on, he wanted to join
in the Marines. He had a nickname at El Toro of Oswaldovsky.
Yeah, exactly. So he was getting into that stuff. Now, when you start reading into communist literature, that also includes the revolutionary actions that happened even before the communist revolution in Russia was completed. And what was that action? Those were assassination attempts against the Tsars, against the Romanovs. These were bombings, and trains got derailed. And some of these Romanovs in Russia, they got killed by these revolutionary terrorists. So by getting into communist literature, you're getting into this terrorism, essentially, because this is how the revolution happened. This is how it was prepared. They created this stage of chaos in Russia, in Tsarist Russia. They created this chaos by assassinating some of the leaders. Killing a Romanov is not too different than killing Kennedy, right? You get the ball rolling. And this was sort of the revolutionary strategy behind the Kennedy assassination. Because once you start killing these people, you get things in motion. Because some people will be shocked, and some people will actually agree with the communists. And then these people get to fight with each other. And this is kind of the strategy that Oswald was getting into even when he was a teenager. And people tried to argue he was a normal guy. No, he was not. I mean, by reading more descriptions about
mother.
Oswald, I'm getting Adolf Hitler vibes when I read these descriptions. He was strange guy, loner, likely gay, violent, narcissistic. Every box was ticked.
Well, in this book, of course, by Mr. Gregory, who knew the Oswalds and had met his mother, one of the things is Oswald had a highly narcissistic mother who could not get along with men at all. And of course, his father died when Oswald was 2 months old or something. So he didn't have a father figure at all. And there's all kinds of pathology surrounding Oswald being the younger brother, by the way, his older brother Robert, and there's an older half brother. That his brother Robert, by the way, is, will say publicly, I don't know if he's still alive, but he said, my brother did this. He was in no doubt. Oswald's older brother, which is something, I mean, when it's in your family. But his mother was so narcissistic and all about herself.
And money.
That one of the Secret Service agents who had to deal with her, because after the assassination, she came to be near her daughter-in-law and her grandchildren. She came there supposedly to help, but it was all about her at center stage. And this one Secret Service agent, as Posner reports, said, I now know why he shot the president.
Oh
It's
my
his
God.
mother made him
Yeah.
who he was.
Yeah, and
You know,
he was violent towards his mother because eventually the power dynamic shifted somewhat when he got older because he was so intimidating. He was threatening his mother with a knife. He was threatening other people with a knife. He tossed a knife at somebody. He was beating his mother. He was beating his future wife, apparently, his fake wife, all the time. So he was just that kind of an unstable character. And at some point, when he was truant, because they lived in different places. At some point, they lived in New York, and so in these big cities, if you didn't go to school, the government would come knocking at your door and they would ask these questions. And they were trying to figure out, was this kid just spending time doing fun things? Because most of these truant kids, they just wanted to have fun, but not Oswald. So they found this kid who was not going to school, but it was just a loner, a very, very strange loner, not really doing anything but read communist literature. So they had him evaluated by professional psychologists. And they said that he was in touch with reality insofar that he was not a full schizophrenic, but they said he was schizoid, he was dangerous, he was violent. He had these delusions of becoming, a historical figure, and he said that in the future multiple times that he was dreaming about becoming, a famous name in history. And so, yeah, even the professionals said that he was dangerous. He was somebody who could do very violent things, and he was not normal. And everybody thought he was gay, literally. Everybody thought he was gay. Even his later best friend, who was very strange, Mr. de Mohrenschildt, people in the Marine Corps, people at school earlier, everybody assumed he was gay. And he got bullied a lot. And so he hated people even more, the regular society. He hated them even more.
By the way, did you happen to read what Edward J. Epstein wrote about Mohrenschildt? He was interviewing him when he supposedly committed suicide after a break for lunch, right? Isn't that odd? And Pachepa thinks Mohrenschildt and his wife were KGB agents.
That is a very strong possibility because de Mohrenschildt, he was kind of this international dashing man, a man of mystery. He was working in oil development or some kind of international business, so he was traveling a lot. And he liked parties. He was very extroverted, and he was doing these things where he would appear at a party in swimming trunks and just to be seen, to be viewed as a extrovert. And the thing is this, Oswald and his phony wife, they were hanging around these exiled people from Russia, these emigres from Russia. And these emigres were normally solid or even upper middle class people. And de Mohrenschildt, he was a high flying guy, But and people wondered, why are these emigres dealing with the Oswalds?
Because Oswald is a guy who couldn't hold down a job.
No,
he couldn't literally support his wife.
They were living in the worst parts of Fort Worth, in the literal slums of Fort Worth, and everybody thought Oswald was just, I'm not trying to use bad language here because of the YouTube algorithm, but everybody thought he was arrogant, dumb, not really educated, and just horrible person. So why would the highly educated de Mohrenschildt strike a friendship with Oswald when everybody else hated Oswald? And so the thing is this. Some people have seized, of course, they tried to jump on this whole de Mohrenschildt thing to again claim this was all a CIA plot. Because when you traveled internationally, and this was even part of the Eastern territories, if you travel a lot, you will have some sort of contact with a special CIA bureau, and they were talking to tens of thousands of people over the years. So they want to stay in touch with people that go abroad and do these kind of things. So that does not mean at all. That does not mean that de Mohrenschildt was working for the CIA. But people try to use these little things, omit the context, and then make a specific claim. So, like, why would this guy hang out? And there's even quotes where de Mohrenschildt had suggested to Oswald to kill somebody important like Walker. I think he even suggested Walker. If somebody killed that guy, that would be doing the country a favor. Sort of just
and it's so
suggestions.
strange that Congress is opening up this investigation in the 70s again, the Kennedy death, and de Mohrenschildt is supposed to testify. And Edward J. Epstein goes and interviews him, has him interview, and then they break for lunch. And the next thing he hears sirens in the distance, and he's going, "What happened?" And then he finds out the guy he was just interviewing supposedly shot himself, right?
With a shotgun, yeah.
During the break. It's so, and of course, like I said, Pachepa said, no, the Mohrenschildts are obviously agents of this Soviet bloc. This is obvious. And of course, I think you want your agents to watch each other, keep tabs on each other. And then there is this thing which the documentary shows. Oswald developed these relationships when he was in Minsk. There was this KGB training school there in Minsk where Cubans were coming. Mm-hmm. And he and Marina, they met these Cubans, one of who is a Cuban high-level intelligence official interviewed in the documentary. He agreed to interview. And just sort of, he mocked the interviewer saying, it's kind of funny, you supposedly flew to Dallas on the day Oswald shot Kennedy. You knew this guy, you went to Mexico City, then you went to Dallas. And he says, oh no, this is all not true, and what is true and what is false about the Kennedy assassination? Did the Americans really land on the moon? Mm-hmm. And he keeps referring to, maybe the Americans didn't land on the moon. This was his one reaction in this documentary. It was interesting to watch, but this guy was a guy who had become friends with Marina and Lee Oswald in the Soviet Union when they were all there in Minsk together.
And we know by now that right after the Kennedy assassination, Oswald wanted to get to a specific bus. He left some money and instructions again for his phony wife, but he wanted to get on a certain Greyhound bus, cross the border into Mexico, and then finally get to Cuba and be hailed as some sort of a hero, because this was something that we saw over and over again in Oswald's life. He wanted to be someone important, and he wanted status, and he wanted that kind of position he thought was appropriate for him. So if this had worked out to his liking, he would have shot the president, get on a bus, drive to Mexico, and make contact with the Soviet embassy and the Cuban embassy, and go to Cuba or the Soviet Union, and they would just exfiltrate him, and he would be hailed a hero ever after.
Yeah, it's interesting, and of course they would maintain that he was innocent, and that he would be persecuted. But what's interesting is, of course, now the circumstances of the assassination. Oswald and his wife were separated. He would live in boarding houses and do a job, and he would go home for the weekends. His wife was, because he couldn't afford to support her, she was living with a lady who was separated from her husband, kind of a hippie type person, very liberal, very left. Her name was Ruth Payne. Yeah. And Marina and the baby lived there, so these two women lived together. Ruth Payne got to be very close with Marina. And of course, Ruth Payne in later years and at the time had no doubt that Oswald shot, and she, because Oswald kept the rifle he shot Kennedy with in her garage. Mm-hmm. And Ruth Payne's husband, although they were separated, he spent a lot of time at the house. And he actually, in the garage, he saw the rifle. It was wrapped in a greenish what was it, a blanket or canvas, whatever it
Cloth.
was
Yeah.
wrapped in, and he respected the privacy of them. He thought it was something else. He thought it was camping equipment, but it was a rifle. The day that, and this goes to the witnesses, the day that Kennedy was shot, Oswald worked in the book depository building. He brought that rifle to work, but he had it all wrapped up, and he carpooled. He didn't drive. Oswald, in fact, had his first driving lesson. I think Ruth Paine gave him his first driving lesson a few weeks before Dallas. And he put the rifle in the trunk of the car. I think it was the trunk of the car where he carpooled, and they asked him what it was, and he said it was curtain rods. To try to explain why this long thing, he's bringing it to work. And of course, he brought it upstairs to this corner window in an upper floor from which the shooting of the president occurred. And if you go into the details, of course, you realize, and Posner goes very much into the details, that indeed there's enough witness testimony about what, because during lunch, because the president was shot at about 12:30 p.m., they all came out to watch the president, but Lee didn't come out to watch. He went up to this corner place where he made a sniper's nest. He took a bunch of book boxes or whatever they were, and he formed this sniper's nest in this corner window. And there were people actually on the floor below him looking out the window where the ceiling shook from the rifle shots. They knew where it was coming. And there was a fellow across the street who saw it. A lot of people saw the rifle pointing out that window. So there's lots of witnesses.
Yeah, and also
not all witness testimony is perfect, right?
Yeah, and also he got that job at the school book depository before there was even a specific plan for the presidential motorcade. So it's not like he read it in the newspaper what the route was going to be, and then he applied for the job and he got the job. No,
that's right.
He got the job, and then just somebody later, or he got the job, and then somebody decided what the route was going to be for the presidential motorcade.
I think Ruth Paine had was it her brother or someone worked there, and they had an opening, and she found out, and they sent him down there, and he got the job. And that's just weeks before Dallas. He gets this job because he's basically unemployed. He's been living on his unemployment insurance for these weeks, like when he goes to Mexico. And before that, he'd been in New Orleans working, supposedly, right? I mean, he did have a job there, but that's where he was in the that committee for supporting Castro, right? And, also, and where he got involved with these Cuban exiles, and he was trying to infiltrate them. He was pretending to be an anti-communist, by the way.
And of course, Oswald, he started to shoot at police officers. He shot at one police officer.
He killed a police officer.
And then he shot at more police officers. Would an innocent person do this? An innocent person would say, what's the matter here?
Yeah. Let's describe his getaway. It was pretty ingenious what he did. When he shot the president, he hid the rifle in another part of this upper floor. He ran immediately downstairs to the lunchroom and pretended like he was having lunch down there. He got a Coke out of the machine, and the police rushed into the building, and that's when they first saw him, and they kind of dismissed him as a suspect because he seemed to be having lunch and drinking a Coke or whatever. He quickly then slipped out before they sealed the building to get everybody there as witnesses. He got out. He got on a bus. He actually gave up a taxi cab to an older lady. He got on a bus. He went home and he got his handgun. He got his pistol. And then he was on foot going somewhere else, probably to another bus station where he was probably going to go to Mexico, right? But then they had this description of him. They kind of pieced together that it was him, and they had this description. And Officer Tippett, who was a Dallas policeman, saw this guy walking. Maybe he saw a bulge, where he had the handgun. Who knows what he saw? I mean, he should have been more cautious. He decided to pull over his squad car and asked and questioned the guy. And of course, Oswald shot him dead, Officer Tippett, with his pistol.
Maybe I should quickly mention something that sometimes when people carry, let's say, a handgun or a revolver, you can tell, or at least cops can tell, because they angle themselves, or I've seen some police guidelines on how to recognize somebody who is having a gun, but is not calm enough to hide it and just act normally, because sometimes people they just move differently when they have a gun because they're so conscious of that gun.
Yeah, and I owned a security company in Southern California. I was trained by an LAPD guy, and if somebody's going to hurt you, it's something they have in their hand. So you watch what they're doing with their hands is one of the giveaway. Is one of their hands in a pocket? How are they walking? What is their attitude? You can tell by the way people are walking how aggressive they are. So there's these different things, and I don't know the training they had in Dallas at the time, but Tippit was considered a very good police officer. And of course, there were terrible, slanderous things written about Tippit, being corrupt and being in it with Ruby and Oswald, and about them knowing each other. It's all nonsense, complete nonsense, which was terrible for Tippit's widow, but there were many witnesses to the shooting. And because it happened in broad daylight, and it happened where many people heard the shot. Nobody actually, I think, saw him shooting. They saw him with the gun in the hand running away. They heard the shots, and witnesses said that Oswald muttered audibly, "Poor dumb cop," after he shot him. Yeah. And then he ran down the street, and he ran into a movie theater without paying. And a guy who was, I think it was an auto shop across the street, he saw this guy run in without paying, and he heard the sirens. And he thought, I better report this. This is suspicious.
There was even another
raid.
That's
how the police figured out that Oswald was in a theater. Yeah.
And this was not even the only business or the only place that was raided. There was actually another place that got raided by police because of some suspect description, and that turned out to be nothing. Yeah. So by going into that cinema, that was not some singular thing. This was just trying to find the shooter, and they had already tried another place, and so this was just one of. Yeah.
Well, they carefully surrounded the theater to make sure that he couldn't get out, and they went in, and he was armed, and of course he tried to pull the gun out to shoot in the theater, but they wrestled it out of his hand, and they took him in, and of course he was a little roughed up because they had to subdue him. So I think I'm not sure if it was a black eye, but he had some bruises when they brought him in, but yeah, they were able to take him. And of course, if that fellow hadn't reported he was in that theater, he might have gotten away.
He'd be in Mexico and never to be seen again. I mean,
never to be seen. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we can speculate, of course, had he made his way to that bus to Mexico.
Yeah.
Had he gone to the Soviet embassy or the Cuban embassy, what would the communists have done with him? Would they have eliminated him?
Well, no, because they would have denied that he was there, or who knows what. But look at how they've defended him. He's innocent. I think most Americans think he's a patsy now. This is how effective you've got since the Kennedy death. You've got 61 years of communist propaganda surrounding the assassination. So Lee Harvey Oswald's a patsy, and you've got Tucker Carlson saying, "Oh, the CIA killed Kennedy."
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and people believe it, even though I mean, Oswald. If Oswald's innocent, what is he doing shooting a police officer? What is he doing trying to shoot the people that arrested him? Mm-hmm. Why does his wife immediately say in front of people, and I point out Gregory's book, say she knows he did it? Why does his brother Robert think he did it? It's and why does he make a sniper's nest and take curtain rods to work with it? I mean, the circumstantial evidence is so huge.
And obviously, what is supposed to be the motive for when these people, say that, Oswald was a patsy or he was run by the CIA? What would have been the CIA's motive to kill Kennedy?
Yeah.
Kennedy was not, and many people still believe that falsehood to this day. Kennedy and his brother, they were not mortal enemies of covert operations. Quite the contrary. They were very
they were big. They were up to their
versed,
eyeballs in covert ops.
very deep into covert operations. They knew how important that was. So that's not a reason. Of course, Kennedy got angry at the CIA after the Bay of Pigs, and there was always, even before Kennedy, and even after Kennedy, there was always some rumblings. Couldn't we restructure, American intelligence? Shouldn't we, rejuvenate the CIA? Shouldn't we do this and that? These discussions always existed. So that's not a motive to kill Kennedy at all. And then, of course,
reason why the CIA gets caught covering up for this Kennedy assassination is because they were all afraid of World War III, and they were also afraid of their own incompetence being exposed. The KGB and the CIA had a thing. Johnson was afraid of World War III. When he recruited Earl Warren to do the Warren Commission, Warren said, "I don't want to do this. Here's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He does not want to do this. This is not his thing." And he says, "No." And he says, "Well, you were in uniform. We could have World War III here with Cuba and the Soviet Union. We need somebody to guide this so it doesn't become World War III," because they all were alive when World War I began with the assassination of Francis Ferdinand. I mean, these people, when they were kids, this is what these older men who were governing everything, this was in their living memory, is that a world war started because a leader was assassinated. And so it was no joke. And if you go to Joseph J. Treno's book, The Secret History of the CIA, it's so funny. The CIA killed Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy was running the CIA secretly. The Attorney General of the United States was actually running the CIA, running these covert ops himself. So it was not, and he was meeting with Anatoly Golitsyn and James Angleton. And of course, we haven't really touched on the importance of the Golitsyn for the Soviets. This is another motive. There's two motives the Soviets have for killing Kennedy, other than Khrushchev was mad at him. The motive being that the Kennedy brothers were now listening to Golitsyn and Angleton. Yeah. And they were buying the monster plot thesis from what we know. And the other thing is they were running the CIA, and they knew there were moles in the CIA, and they wanted to get them. And that the Kennedy brothers, contrary to the claim that they weren't going to prosecute this is the new scenario now. All these bunglers who can't do deduction, who say that the Army, now they're saying that the Army killed, it wasn't the CIA that killed Kennedy, it was the United States Army because they wanted to fight the Vietnam War. That's preposterous, right? It's preposterous. But yet they have these elaborate, and you can listen, I've spent hours listening to these guys, and it's like, this is just gobbledygook. It's just nonsense.
Yeah, and also
nothing here makes any sense.
Yeah, and also of course, there's the very classic, description of a motive that's been around for many decades now, and that is this idea that John F. Kennedy wanted to destroy the central bank, the Federal Reserve System.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
because there was like an executive order concerning some silver coins. This was nothing really important, but this had been misconstrued into this idea that Kennedy was going to take away the power over money. He was going to take over power over money, and he would end the Federal Reserve System. So he would basically take away the power of the Jewish world conspiracy, and therefore the Jewish world conspiracy killed Kennedy. So this, of course, plays into, the Birchers, the Bircher audience, all the conspiracy mythology, basically. And, when I was assembling my notes on Kennedy in the 60s and these emigre circles that, these Russian emigre circles that Oswald was running around in, when I was researching that, I found a significant role of the Romanovs, the exiled Romanovs, because they were all over the place. They were networking in America. They were networking in Europe. They tried to build this grand anti-communist movement. And so they worked with, retired U.S. generals. They worked with Henry Ford. They worked with, the Birchers. So it was Romanov money flowing into this, and there was also the reputation of the Romanovs flowing into this whole thing. So sometimes people believe that conspiracy literature or conspiracy media was just created by some cranks, some loners, some cranks, just some people in their basement making up stuff. No, this was a larger thing because the Romanovs themselves had really started that whole idiotic thing about the protocols of Zion, because it was their guy, Sergei Nilus, who came up with the protocols. And the Romanovs, they not just pushed this narrative of the fake protocols, they also expelled 20,000 Jews from Moscow, and they were doing all this stuff. And after the communist revolution, the Romanovs kept feeding into this idea that the communist threat was in essence a Jewish threat. And many people in the West were eating this stuff up. Even influential people were pushing this stuff in the West. And so this also became a false narrative in the Kennedy assassination, that he wanted to destroy the power of the Jews, and that's why the Jews took him out. So this is kind of one of the strongest ideas that's being spread,
you've got all these, and of course the leftists have the theory that he was going to bring peace between the Soviet Union but it wasn't. All of these are sort of obscure what really was going on. You have and I just mention another conspiracy theory. This is The Reporter. And of course, the Reporter Who Knew Too Much by Mark Shaw, which is about the mysterious death of Dorothy Kilgallen, who was famous on a television show, a very popular TV show I watched when I was a kid. The whole family was called What's My Line? And she was the smart one who always guessed right who the people were. Who they'd have these mystery guests, and you'd have to guess which one was the famous person whose face wasn't really known. They even have people whose faces were, and they'd black the face out. Audie Murphy was on there once, and you would have to guess which one was. Others would impersonate this famous person, and you'd have to guess which one was the real one, or an extraordinary person of some kind. But Kilgallen got interested in Jack Ruby, and she was the only journalist to interview him off camera, so to speak, in jail before Ruby died. Ruby got a retrial, but then he died of cancer. He had cancer throughout his body. It was in his brain and his liver, maybe part of his late stage craziness. He was also, Jack Ruby was Jewish, and he thought that we were going to destroy the Jews. He had these fantasies or these hallucinations that Jews were being bombed and Jews were being murdered, and
in underground secret bases, right? In underground,
yes, right, underground
bases.
Torture chambers, whatever. Ruby got pretty crazy. Of course, his body was riddled with cancer, and of course they misdiagnosed.
He was a
the
very
cancer.
Impulsive guy.
He
saw Oswald smirking, and he thought, I'm gonna get him.
I'm going to get him. And the funny thing about Ruby was that people say he was a gangster. The mob, his favorite thing was to hang out with the police. And the mob didn't trust him, and he had a big mouth. He was talkative. He was super talkative guy. And the mob thought, no, we can't trust him. Yeah. So he comes down from, I think it was Chicago area, and he goes and settles in Dallas, where there's this Jewish northerner in this southern town. He had this nightclub that was kind of, on the edge of failing a lot of the time. So he wasn't considered that smart. And he was a hot-tempered, fly off at the handle, violent kind of person. And he always carried a loaded gun with him. So that was the kind of person that shot Oswald.
Yeah, and he thought he was going to be a hero.
They make Dorothy.
They thought they would make him a hero, for shooting.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
he thought he'd be released, and in fact, thousands of letters came in congratulating him for shooting Oswald. But in this book, they make because Kilgallen died in a rather strange way, supposedly of a overdose of sleeping pills and alcohol, and after she did this investigation, and so they've created this author Mark Shaw creates this scenario to reopen the investigation into her death, but it doesn't make any sense. Unfortunately. And there's another one called Mary's Mosaic, which was Mary. I forget her last name. I've read the book, and some people are really hot on it. She was one of JFK's lovers who thought there was a conspiracy, and in fact, she was married to one of these CIA guys, and actually separated from him. And so James Angleton came in and took care of her effects. But of course, James Angleton was friends with Bobby Kennedy. And if there was an affair there, Angleton might want to make sure that this didn't become general knowledge. But we don't, but people make this conspiracy that James Angleton then was covering up for this. They had to kill Mary because she knew too much, right? So Mary's Mosaic. So there's just this dozens of these Kennedy conspiracy books which latch on to some little odd fact, but there's no there.
Yeah, and also when we look at this, fairy tale, or this almost liberation theology, that was created concerning Kennedy. When we look at that, it's this idea that this man, pretty much by himself, wanted to take on the U.S. establishment, the right-wing deep state, because back then people talked about a right-wing deep state, not a left-wing deep state like today. And so he was going to, do this rebellion almost by himself. Even though his health was compromised, he was not as healthy as the public thought he was, and he had no team assembled. He had no team to lead this rebellion. It was just this guy, but he almost by himself wanted to save America and destroy the Federal Reserve and destroy the Jewish conspiracy and destroy the military-industrial complex and all these things. The same kind of template was used later with Donald Trump, by the Q movement and some of these people. When they thought that this one guy, Trump, with maybe a team behind him, that Trump was going to save them from this, left-wing deep state. And retroactively, even the assassination against Abraham Lincoln was spun in that way. Conspiracy buffs claimed that Lincoln wanted to change the monetary system and have an interest-free money, a new dollar, and this was against the Jewish conspiracy. So the Jewish conspiracy killed Lincoln, right? So you can use that template. You can use that template over and over again, right? Because it's what people want to hear.
Do.
Because people are used to
over and over again.
People are used to these stories like Star Wars. When you have the chosen one, you have your Luke Skywalker and your Jedi Knights, and they will do the important things to smash the enemy. The chosen one, the prophesized chosen one, like Kennedy is going to save them from the elders of Zion, basically. This is sort of the
and of course the other fake conspiracy theories. There's two other ones, and one of course is that the mafia killed John Kennedy. And of course, they somehow try. And of course, you've got Jim Garrison's crazy trial of Clay Shaw. And Clay Shaw was homosexual. And it was, this is a persecution of a guy because he's homosexual. And Jim Garrison was a highly unethical. This is what the movie JFK is about, by the way. It's lionizing Jim Garrison, Jim Garrison was a hideous criminal himself as a prosecutor. He brought false testimony. He threatened witnesses into giving false testimony.
He just fumbled numbers any way he wanted to make a connection.
He was crazy, literally. And of course, there's a testimony I've heard. Ruth Payne, who was living with Marina Oswald, he tried to get her she actually came out to New Orleans, and she said, "I just got a couple hours of this guy," and I said, "He's crazy. I'm out of here."
Yeah.
She wasn't going to cooperate with him at all. because she saw right away it wasn't true, and it was all false, because she knew what she knew. But he's bringing up all these things because, see, Lee Harvey Oswald had spent that time in New Orleans before he came back to Dallas-Fort Worth and shot the president. So it's this is all, caused. Of course, he was Jim Garrison was a prosecutor in New Orleans, and of course linked. Now it's Lee Harvey Oswald, might have been a homosexual, might have had sexual relationships. Doesn't mean these people were guilty of plotting with him, right?
Yeah, exactly.
To kill the president. So it's a very funny thing. But so that's the one thing. But the mafia connection, the mafia was bugged by the FBI and by police. The mafia, they were sitting on under the Kennedy administration. They were sitting on the mafia, and certainly the mafia wanted to kill a Kennedy. The Kennedy they wanted to kill was Bobby. He was the one going after the mafia.
Exactly.
And so, I think the closest they have is them discussing it and going, we'll be wiped out. We don't dare do that. It's not something that they could do. That would be suicide for the mafia, to go up against the U.S. government and to make war on the president of the United States. And then the other big conspiracy theory is that Johnson, who was facing, he's a very corrupt politician, very bad guy, that he was going to be booted out. He wasn't going to be on the ticket the next time, and that's very possible that he was behind it. But you see, when you read the books about, it's great to go through all the corruption of Johnson, but they don't have, there's no there either. There's no, okay, so where's the smoking gun? Where's the evidence? Really? Okay, he's corrupt. That doesn't mean that isn't proof he killed JFK.
Yeah, and also when we look into the KGB, when we look into the Soviet Union in all of this, then of course we go right into this kind of a discussion that was so heated in the 1960s, with Angleton especially and Bagley, and then these defectors came in, and then these other defectors came in and started to blame the earlier defectors, and then everybody wanted to blame everybody. And
we should mention Nosenko now. We should, because Nosenko defects right after the Kennedy assassination, and Pete Bagley, who I've interviewed and I corresponded with, was the CIA guy in Switzerland who had initially tried to hook Yuri Nosenko, as a double agent to work for us, but Nosenko didn't really do anything. And then he pops up after the Kennedy assassination, and he says, "Oh, I had the Oswald file," and of course,
and I have to defect Nosenko, now. You have to bring me to America because the KGB is after me. I need to be brought to America and stashed in a nice safe house, and because they're after
it's interesting that Golitsyn, who defected,
he said they recalled him, but they never did.
Right. He lied about a number of things that we could get into, Nosenko did, which is why Bagley ultimately, who brought him in, it was his prize. He would have bragging rights for bringing Nosenko in, but he ends up rejecting Nosenko, saying, now he's a false defector. And Bagley wrote a book about this more than a decade ago called Spy Wars, where he goes into it, and he even has some Spy Master. He has the guy have a former KGB general admit to him. He said, "Why did you believe that man?" Nosenko. But it was Golitsyn defected in December of 1961, and Golitsyn had said, "Look, they're going to send a fake defector to discredit me, and here's the characteristics this fake defector." Well, Nosenko had those characteristics, and so this was kind of, so Angleton, when Bagley thought he had something good with Nosenko, Angleton said he's lying about his rank, right? He's lying about these things about his background, which Angleton was in a position to know, because Angleton was the head of the counterintelligence staff, so where they collated all kinds of data from the other departments. It was like the master brain of the CIA. So they could figure things out other people couldn't. And so Bagley was like, "Oh my gosh!" And when I asked Bagley in person, talking to him, when I asked him whether or not he thought that Angleton was kooky or kind of crazy because people had made these accusations against it. He said, James Angleton was my friend and he was not insane. He was very intelligent and he knew his business.
Yeah, and this is kind of the heart of the whole affair, because for the Soviet propaganda, Western counterintelligence is always paranoia. It's always evil. It's always bad. It's part of an imperialist conspiracy, right? So it's not just Angleton that got hit with that sort of cliche over and over again, but it was virtually any sort of anti-communism was painted that way. Any sort of McCarthy was painted that way. Baseline counterintelligence was described the same way. It's always just paranoia. But people really have to appreciate how difficult that time was and how difficult it was to navigate inside the CIA, because the CIA was not like the KGB. Now in Russia, if there was any sort of suspicion, you could get in trouble very quickly, no matter how high-ranking you were, no matter who you were friends with. This happened fairly quickly, and also when we absolutely know that the Soviets, they never trusted anybody, so they didn't even trust the Cambridge Five. Really,
the Soviets were so paranoid.
They didn't even trust. They didn't even trust the spy ring in Nazi Germany, like the source Werther. They always wanted to know who the source was. They weren't given the information. And when World War II was over, Moscow recalled all these people involved, and they were willing to squeeze them because of one screw up that led to a bunch of dead Soviet soldiers. But all the other information was golden, but they were so paranoid they wouldn't even trust their most stellar assets and agents and sources. So this is kind of Angleton couldn't do what and Angleton couldn't do what the Soviets could do.
The Soviets, so he could not take suspicion to its logical conclusion in anything. And of course, Americans had this idea from McCarthy being attacked. They had this idea that fairness was more important than security. So that if a person was a security risk, but you didn't have absolute, you didn't have him red-handed passing secrets to the Soviets, you had to keep him, right? Otherwise, you were unfair. You couldn't just dismiss somebody because he had relatives who were communists and he'd been involved in communist front organizations, and his own dad was a member of the Communist Party, what became the Communist Party, Soviet Union, the Russian Social Democratic Party. As in the case of Walt Rostow, you couldn't say he's a security risk, don't hire him. I mean, he could be a professor at a university, fine. We're not going to destroy his life. He just can't have government secrets. He can't be important in the Cold War.
Yeah,
right. Why is it your right to be a person high up in the U.S. government when you have these compromising things?
And then when this guy defects, this Nozenko, he's very suspicious. Nozenko lies about stuff. There was even a legitimate concern within the CIA that Nozenko would quickly turn against the CIA. He would run to the Soviet embassy in America and say, the CIA kidnapped me. Which happened
later, by the way, in the 1980s to a defector.
Or I wanted to tell the Americans the truth about Oswald, about our Oswald file, that we had no interest in Oswald, but this evil CIA, they wanted to, hurt me or destroy what I had to say. So there was concern if we get Nozenko, if we let them into America, he would turn on us in an instant. So that's when ultimately the decision was made, and I don't think it was even Angleton's sole decision, or even Angleton's decision at all, to incarcerate Nozenko, because I think Angleton wanted just to play Nozenko. He wanted to
Angleton
use
liked a
Nozenko
looser game.
And but somebody made the decision to lock Nozenko up, and Nozenko, he was, if I understand it correctly, Nozenko was not a United States citizen. So sometimes you actually can play hardball.
He died as a U.S. citizen, and he died as a CIA hero.
Yeah.
He ended up becoming the most important. He ended up being a high-level CIA official himself. So the thing about Nosenko that's important is that Nosenko was a very powerful piece on the Cold War chessboard created by Moscow. And here's why he was such a powerful piece. Nobody wanted to believe that Kennedy was killed by a KGB agent, or even a communist, or killed by somebody who did it for Castro. They didn't want to believe that. They wanted that to be gone. And especially if they were left-wingers who thought that Kennedy was killed by a right-winger. It's almost like whatever your political religion, you have your pet theory about the Kennedy killing. And Nosenko is there to exonerate the left, the KGB, the Soviet Union and Cuba. He's there to exonerate them. And that is so powerful. And he's against Angleton, who, by the way, Angleton is seen within the CIA as a threat to everybody that might have a black mark against them in their security file. Angleton's going to make sure you don't get the job you want, the promotion you want. You don't even maybe get to stay in the CIA if you've got one of these black marks. And so you had a lot of people then lining up. You had this power beginning to form around the Nosenko narrative, because it's countering now. It's taking down Angleton and the counterintelligence staff, because the counterintelligence staff was the brain and the check on everything that they had, an ultimate check on everything the CIA did.
Yeah.
And that check was ultimately removed.
Yeah, and also, I mean, they asked Nosenko specific questions, very detailed questions that Nosenko should have had the answers to. Because when you create a false history, a false backstory, a legend, what they call it, when you create a false backstory, and it involves a high specific position, intelligence, or the military, it's almost impossible to memorize anything that a real person would remember. Because if you spend all these years and decades, working in a specific directorate of the KGB or something, if you worked for decades in that job, you could easily answer all kinds of very specific questions. But if you have to learn a false history that was prepared for you, you don't have all these details, or you cannot even remember all these details that were given to you as part of that false history. So Angleton had a massive challenge on his hand, and even Angleton even tested the CIA's own Soviet Russia division by handing out false information, which then led the KGB to transfer agents back to Russia. Now, this was just a standard method used by Angleton. They called it a marked card. So you spread some false information, and then this false information ends up with the Russians. But you've only given that information to a very small circle. So now you can see that there's a problem in that circle. That may be a bug, that may be somebody from that division, or somebody works with somebody from that division, or the girlfriend or the wife of somebody from the division. There's multiple possibilities, but you cannot fault Angleton for applying standard techniques that any intelligence professional would have used. This is just like that's just the business, and people cannot be intimidated by the complexities of it.
Yeah, it's very strange. Nosenko claimed to be a major, I think it was, and they found out that he lied about his rank. The other thing that he didn't know, under interrogation, he did not know, the first chief directorate headquarters were in Yasenivo, and he didn't know where the elevator was in the building, or I think the cafeteria. He could not, in a place where he worked, he didn't know basic things. Yeah. So when you prepare someone with a legend or a false identity, there were ways that we had to figure out that he was lying about who he was and what he had done.
It's the same thing when these fake Navy SEALs run around. This stolen valor phenomenon where people claim they used to be Navy SEALs. And they sometimes get the tattoos, or they get some other fake memorabilia from the Navy SEALs. And then there's this one guy I forgot his name. What's his Don Shipley or something? And Shipley was a real Navy SEAL, so he can actually do these background checks if people want to find out if somebody is phony or not. They just contract Shipley to check out that person, and so oftentimes it's just a phone call. Hey, so you're saying you were a Navy SEAL? So what year or what was your BUDS class number? What was the number of your class? Because every SEAL would remember that. And then he asks, what year did your class graduate? Because Shipley has the actual database, the actual list, and then he asks other questions like you just mentioned. At the Navy SEAL training school, where's the bell that you can ring to exit the program? What is a dragger? Have you fired a dragger? And people say, yes, of course I fired a dragger. Well, a dragger is like a scuba device. So you can ask these people specific details, and if they don't know these details, they're phonies. And when Nosenko was imprisoned, he would withdraw inside of himself, and he would just repeat a very baseline story. He would say very few things. Now, somebody who is innocent would rather start talking, talking as much as you can, giving the CIA as much information as you can, giving him all these details to bolster your credibility. But if you're a phony, you would revert back to these very baseline lies that you're trying to protect.
Yeah,
that was some
episode. So this is the shocking thing that that happened here in 1964 with they tried to break Nosenko by putting him in, I think it was an attic of a safe house where they kept him prisoner, and they used sleep deprivation techniques on him. They tried to get him to admit that he was a false defector. Bagley said that there was one point at which he thought that Nosenko was about to break. He was very close. But what happened is that those people who were against this figuring it out, who had this other narrative in mind, decided to end it all. And they thought this was a great travesty and injustice to Nosenko. And they basically rehabilitated him. And this was the beginning of the end for Angleton and Golitsyn within the CIA. Because Nosenko was destined to become the hero defector who had the truth. So there's not enough room for two truths. Even if people were doubting and saying, well, it could be one or the other, they couldn't suspend disbelief like that. They went with Nosenko. And so when you look at all these CIA books written by former CIA people, whether it's Robert Gates's 2 memoirs, his first one, From the Shadows, or some of the others, the ones that were working in counterintelligence hunting moles, they always badmouth Angleton and Golitsyn, and they believe in Nosenko. And that it became the pattern. That became institutionalized, basically. Nosenko died, 10, 12, 13 years ago? And he was in good standing with the CIA when he died. This was the official thing. So every deception operation then that the KGB would put forward, the KGB had this guy inside the CIA to tell them what was what.
Yeah.
And this was very bad.
Yeah, and I thought that when I was looking into and preparing my notes here about the defectors and the battle inside the CIA and how an intelligence war has its victims. This is just the nature of it. So you cannot expect a perfectly clean intelligence war where nobody gets hurt. But when I was assembling my notes, I was looking into the initial Operation Trust by the Soviets. And we're gonna do a whole show about that whole phenomenon. I was looking into how more operations like Trust were started, and it was always about infiltrating the Western right wing. Not just the Western right wing, but also the larger anti-communist circles. So this included Russian emigres, and these were groups oftentimes even supported by the exiled Romanovs. So they had all these different groups and orders, and they would even recruit retired American generals. They would recruit former British heads of naval intelligence. So they were trying to create this international anti-communist movement, but the Soviets were always infiltrating it. And when I was looking into the defector Goleniewski from Poland, this problem became even more obvious, because Goleniewski he gave very important information to, I think, the British and the CIA. And he gave away some very valuable intelligence, but Goleniewski he had a difficult personality, and so it was starting to alienate people in and outside of the agency. And at some point, the agency stopped working with him. And
Golitsyn has a similar pattern, by the way. Defectors, the people who defect may not be psychologically your average
happy.
Normal.
Yeah.
Right.
Happy.
There's a reason they're defecting, which may have psychological components.
And they come from these insane systems. I mean, they've spent their careers, they've spent their lives in an insane communist system. So Goleniewski was becoming more angry, and then he found his new friends. These were these Birchers, Birch Society people. These were some of these fake Knights of Malta groups. Then there was, of course, groups attached to the exiled Romanovs. So this is when Goleniewski was becoming an activist, and he was starting to make some strange claims. I think, when his mental health deteriorated, because I have this in my notes here, I think at some point he thought that he had this newsletter, and he was making outlandish claims. He thought that some journalist was really Reinhard Heydrich, the famous Nazi who was not really assassinated but continued to live as this journalist. All sorts of craziness, and this destroyed Goleniewski's credibility within the agency. I mean, they were grateful for the intelligence he had provided, but other than that, his star was sinking, but it was simultaneously rising with these conspiracy buffs. And it's like this problem. It's like this problem when once you get into these,
they were basically discrediting. If you get involved with certain people on the far right, you can be discredited.
Yeah, this is where sometimes I think that, these conspiracy circles, this is where good ideas go to die. This is sort of the place where some good ideas, they actually die. And as I said before, this is not just, the Birch Society or, your average conspiracy activist out there, even back then. This is not some random people that do this kind of activism. There's some real power behind it. There's some real networks behind it, and some really weird people behind it, like the exiled Romanovs. Now, on the surface, to Goleniewski, who ultimately claimed he was a Romanov himself, he started to make that claim. And he was the son of the last Tsar, and he was smuggled into Poland, he said. So,
which is crazy.
Yeah, but then
by the way, how crazy was it that he claimed he was Alexei Tsarevich? Goleniewski was born in 1922. The Tsarevich was born in 1904. So this is crazy. He's claiming that he's born suddenly 18 years older than he is. He's claiming.
Also, why would the Romanovs, if there had been some play to save the last Tsar and his immediate family, why would the Romanovs and their powerful relatives, in the West, the House of Hessen, basically,
Why would they go to Poland?
Why would they park them in Poland and not go to Denmark
where
or Scotland?
The Poles hated the Romanovs, right?
I mean, you would smuggle these people to Denmark, to your family members, or Britain or Scotland, but not Poland. So I mean, and then there was a Birch article about Goleniewski's claim that he was a Romanov. And then there was a book that was even much longer than this article. And I took some quotes from that book. This was about Goleniewski, especially, and his accusation against Henry Kissinger, which is a very important accusation. Not just because Goleniewski said that he saw the code names, and he could deduct that one of these code names was really Kissinger. This was not just about Goleniewski and what he saw. This should have been a bigger, larger investigation into Kissinger, coming from all different angles. But so this book that came out, these Birchers, they try to focus on the Kissinger thing, and they also focus on Goleniewski's claim of being a Romanov. And they said in the book that there is an affidavit, a collection of facts. There's a collection of facts that would prove Goleniewski was a Romanov, and that collection of facts was done by a former CIA guy. Now, they billed him as the former head of the technical service department of the CIA, which is not true. This guy was actually tasked with a subdivision about forgeries, detecting forgeries. And he was let go at some point. I think it was the late 60s. I think he was let go of the agency when the agency did an internal review, and they were just firing a bunch of people they deemed non-essential, not necessary, not performing to standards. And so this guy was working at the agency, but he wasn't that high up the chain, and he came up with this. When he left the agency, he came up with this affidavit proving Goleniewski's claim. And there's also, I found an old CIA memo that went pretty high up the chain, and it warned about that guy who was working in the forgeries department, who supported, Goleniewski's claim. There was a memo, and it warned about some sources saying that after these two guys from the NSA defected to the Soviet Union, the next two people to defect would be that forgery expert guy and another guy. And so this was a warning, and they started to investigate the warning. But this is just how the craziness of the time, when you have these defectors, and it's a tough situation. It's a really tough situation for everybody involved. And at some point, everybody was accusing everybody. The defectors were accusing each other. And
what's really scary is that the FBI had an agent named Fedora, a KGB agent, and they were trying to confirm Nosenko's rank. And of course, they had, I think it was Peter Deryabin had been defected, was a KGB defector from 1954. Deryabin worked in the same parts of the KGB that Nosenko claimed to have worked. And he had a number of problems. I can't remember all of them with the backstory, Nosenko's backstory. And I forget where they got the idea. I was actually under interrogation. Nosenko admitted he was only a captain. And, but I think it was actually a lieutenant colonel was his initial claim. Well, what was really suspicious is they go to Fedora and they say, what was Yuri Nosenko's rank? And Fedora says, he was a lieutenant colonel, confirming it when he'd already broken down and admitted he was only a captain, right? So this is the kind of thing that all of a sudden now the FBI sees Fedora as their prize agent, who's feeding them all these things that they like. And of course, this is, if you read a lot of these standard histories, Fedora is the good agent, Nosenko's the good agent, Golitsyn's bad, these other people are suspect. So you have this division about who's the bad and who's the good agents. And I wanted to mention the FBI was terrible. And in fact, it's believed by some people that the FBI New York office was full of Soviet agents. And at one point, Hoover was confronted with this. I forget if it was Angleton that forced the issue. It was one of these CIA guys that was forcing the issue, and Hoover didn't deny that he had a problem in his New York office, but he said, if I move people out, some clever journalist will find out and it'll be a scandal on the FBI. So you'd rather keep the bad agents than have the bad publicity, right? That's how Hoover thought. That was his problem. There's this book, Solo, and I was handed this by an American journalist. John Barron wrote it. John Barron, who wrote The KGB Today and The New KGB Today back in the early 80s. Now, this guy, Mr. Morris, is a, and I've got these notes on here, that he was a high-level official of the Communist Party USA who regularly met with Brezhnev and Mao Zedong, and Morris was developing a close relationship with Brezhnev. Well, he was an FBI agent. The FBI recruited this Morris character, who's depicted in this picture on the front of the book, Solo. And of course, he was going to meet with all these top communist leaders around the world as a Communist Party USA official and come back and tell everything, spill the beans to the FBI. Well, what is the story? He goes to Suslov. He's in the Central Committee of the Communist Party Soviet Union building, and they say, oh, we had nothing to do with killing Kennedy. Oh, please, this is such a mess, and we're going to be blamed for it. So he gets to report that back to the FBI. Then he goes and he meets with Mao, and Mao says, these Soviets are awful. I can't work with them anymore. We're enemies now. And he goes and reports that the Sino-Soviet split is real. And it's like, it's not that I would say that Morris was a conscious double agent, but I think that the communists knew he was working for the FBI because they had infiltrated the FBI, and they were feeding him then, oh, let's have him meet with Mao, and Mao will put on a little song and dance, and it'll persuade them that the Sino-Soviet split is real. It'll persuade them that we had nothing to do with Kennedy's death. And it's like, you go through this book and it's just straight up and down what they want to portray to us, and the deception that we've landed in today.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, I keep reminding people that today we know much more than these people knew back then, and we have more opportunities now than people had back then. And nowadays, the task is complex. We cannot just take 3-4 old books by defectors and say there's the ultimate answer. We just have to blindly believe these defectors. No, anytime a serious defector would make an accusation, this launched a proper investigation. Nobody was willing to just blindly trust a lead. You had to confirm it and double confirm it, and you have to do a proper investigation. So it's not just a matter of, are you in the Angleton camp, are you in the anti-Angleton camp? You have to go beyond that, because we're not as limited now as some of these people were back then. So you have to do a full investigation retroactively into Henry Kissinger. You have to look into these other people that were accused, like Sir Roger Hollis. Other people have made interesting material on Roger Hollis.
Chapman Pincher's books on Roger Hollis, for example.
Oh, by the way, there's an interesting side note, because I wanted to mention that back then all kinds of people were accusing everybody. At some point, it came out that Pincher's book and somebody else's work had been co-financed or sponsored by Victor Rothschild, and so when this became public, the conspiracy guys were going crazy again, and they started to accuse Victor Rothschild again of being a member of the Cambridge Five, the fifth man. And so Victor Rothschild was getting angry about it, and he said in public, I cannot even properly defend myself in public because I am bound by the Official Secrets Act of Britain, which is very strict. So I cannot even defend myself against this nonsense that's been published. And then Margaret Thatcher actually jumped in and said, normally I would never ever talk about these things in public, but I'm going to make an exception. I will say we have absolutely zero evidence that Victor Rothschild worked for the Soviets. Now, does that mean we should blindly trust Victor Rothschild? No, but people have to come up with something, something tangible, and not just a bunch of nothing burgers. And by the way, when when people talked about Victor Rothschild, they were including all these older Rothschild mythologies that are absolutely false. And even when even when the Romanovs, the exiled Romanovs, were spreading the protocols of Zion throughout the Cold War and networking with people in the West and spreading this conspiracy nonsense, guess what? All these Romanovs had to do was to ask their own relatives, especially in Britain, to ask their own relatives, hey, is this Jewish world conspiracy thing true? And these relatives could have told them in confidence, no, actually it's fake. We've been using it off and on, over the decades for various, disinformation purposes to, destabilize the French and the Germans and so on. But it's absolutely fake. We've been spreading this nonsense, as disinformation. And we also, the House of Hessen, it was the House of Hessen that initially recruited the Rothschilds, the very first Rothschild. And Meyer Amschel Rothschild, as he was called here, Meyer Amschel Rothschild worked for the House of Hessen, the Landgraf of Hessen, and protected his money from Napoleon. And then Rothschild was referred to the British throne to smuggle money to the troops of Wellington. So the Romanovs could have asked their own relatives from the House of Hessen, is this Jewish conspiracy thing true? No, it's not. We've been using it, as disinformation, but, we run the Rothschilds. There is no Jewish world conspiracy, right?
Yeah, and in trying to figure out who's who in this, people are going to say, oh, I read all these CIA books and Golitsyn is wrong and he never had the truth about anything. Well, the fact of the matter is, the reason why I take the side of Golitsyn and Angleton, and I do it not saying that they're not perfect, they made mistakes, and some of the criticism of them is true, but they're right on the essentials, on the most important understanding of the Cold War, and this comes down to intellectual honesty, and it comes down to what the problem we have today in analysis is that you go back to Richard Weaver's book, Ideas Have Consequences. We've lost the ability to think in terms of abstractions, in terms of universals and transcendentals, which you have to be able to think in order to understand. You can't just be a literalist. But this book here, this is really sort of the ultimate proof, you could say. This is Mark Riebling's book, Wedge, written in 94. At least this edition was. I think there's a more recent edition. But this book, on page 407 and 408, he goes into Golitsyn's correct predictions about the future fall. And Golitsyn wrote this manuscript in 1982. The CIA allowed him to publish the manuscript in 1984. It became a book called New Lies for Old. And just to whet people's appetite, why I have the interpretation of all these events and why it's helpful to put them together right is the guy that had it right was Golitsyn. He predicted the fall of the Soviet Union in detail, in all of its minute details.
And the CIA didn't anticipate. The CIA failed in anticipating.
No, the CIA was against it. And not only that, all these books claim that Golitsyn had, they repeat, Golitsyn had there are six mistaken predictions Golitsyn made out of 139. Out of 148 predictions, he had 139 correct. And Riebling went through it all, and so there's 9 predictions he got wrong or that haven't panned out. And so they keep repeating the 9 he got wrong, but well, wait a minute. The 139 he got right are so amazing and so critical to our strategic understanding of what's really going on in the world today, because his predictions are still coming true, especially about China and Russia and the one clenched fist, that this is why this analysis of the Cold War is so important.
Yeah, but even if Golitsyn had never existed as a human being, if there had never been a Golitsyn, and never defecting, still the overall logic basically tells us what the strategy of the communists would be, because it's such a powerful ploy to fake a split. Because the world was horrified when China became communist, because this was like a large portion of the world's population came on a communist tyranny, and the communists, in China, they wanted to buy Western technology, and the Soviets were threatening everybody. So of course it would have been stupid for the communists to appear in unity. If the communists had all publicly loved each other, they would have gotten a lot more opposition. People would have said, "Of course,
yes.
we're not gonna sell anything to the Chinese. We're not gonna sell anything to the Soviets." But if you fake that split, you can, pretend that it's possible to play the Russians off against the Chinese.
And then you don't have to be as vigilant. You don't have to be as strong in opposing the Soviet Union.
And we can
also think you have China with you.
Exactly. And we can tell that this deception, that was kind of an obvious move in my book. I mean, what else were they going to do? They knew They knew they had to pretend a certain weakness. Fake a weakness, and they knew that communism didn't work, especially internationally. This whole strategy of, preaching Marxism, Leninism, to have all these revolutions everywhere, that was not strong enough. You couldn't have a future as an empire if you could only speak to the left internationally. You also needed to speak to other groups, like the right-wingers.
Yes.
So that other deception, fake ending of the Soviet Union, that was another very obvious to me strategic move. What else were they going to do?
By the way, I've just discovered, thanks to a reader, I've just discovered a smoking gun on this, which I had not found before. And there's so many, I've even forgotten some of the details that prove all this, but this is one that anybody can look up. I'm working on an article on it now. In the William J. Clinton Presidential Archive, they declassified his phone calls and personal meetings with Boris Yeltsin through the 1990s. And his last meeting, not his last phone call, his last physical meeting with Boris Yeltsin, November 19th, 1999. You can go to the Clinton Library. You can download it. I've downloaded it. I'm printing it out. I'm writing an article on it. You can't believe what Boris Yeltsin tells Clinton. Now, this is after the Kosovo War. This is during the war in Chechnya. Yeah. This is when Putin is being set up to be the next leader. And Boris Yeltsin mentions this to Clinton and says, Putin's going to be the next guy. Clinton is bragging to Boris how he's done all these things for him. He's keeping the ABM treaty in place, even though Congress wants to get rid of it. He's gotten rid of our nuclear fissile material stockpile. He's pulling apart our ability to make nuclear warheads. Clinton's telling him these things. And all of a sudden, in the middle of this discussion, Boris Yeltsin breaks in. He goes, Bill, I've read all that and all the details of it. I still believe in you. I mean, I'm literally telling you what. I still believe in you, but Russia wants one thing from the United States. We want you to give us Europe.
Oh, God.
And he says it over and over again, and he keeps pressing him, look, you're not European. We are. We should have Europe. And Bill Clinton is like, the Europeans won't go along with this. I can't, I don't have the power to give you Europe. And he's saying, no, you do. You just have to give us Europe, because all you have to do basically is pull your troops out, and then it's ours. And he says, look, Russia is both European and Asian. I live in Moscow. Moscow is a European city. I'm European. And so Bill Clinton, kind of being a smartass, he says, so you want Asia too because you're part Asian? And Boris doesn't even blink an eye. He goes, well, eventually we'll get to that too.
Oh, no. Oh,
you know?
Yeah, I
So
mean, we can
wait a
tell.
minute, who are
Yeah.
we? Is he talking as a communist? This is a very strange conversation. And by the way, Yeltsin then gets very upset with Clinton, and he says to him, "This meeting has gone on too long. It was supposed to be 20 minutes and it's gone
I
35.
said
I'm
too
out of
much.
here. I'm just leaving."
I already said too
Right?
much here. Oh God. Yeah, but we can
Right?
tell. We
I'm
can.
out of here because you're
Yeah.
not giving me what I want.
Yeah.
And
But
guess what? The next guy that's coming after me is Mr. Putin there.
yeah. Yeah, but we can now. It's 2024. It's not the day and age of Angleton anymore. We can tell how these grand deception operations actually panned out. This is something
Yes.
that could only be guessed, or in the case of the defectors, they could say what they knew about it, and they could
Yeah.
make these predictions, and others could speculate into the future. But now this time has passed, and we can tell that Nixon made the wrong move. Nixon listened to Kissinger and thought, we're going to help China sell all this technology to China to weaken the Soviet Union so we can get maybe, we can negotiate better with the Soviet Union. This turned out to have been the wrong move. This was a deception. There was no real split. The Russians were not really about to go to war with the Chinese. This was a deception. Nixon fell for it. Others fell for it, and the consequences can now be seen every day because all this stuff, a lot of the stuff here is made in China. These electronics are made in China. Components in your car made in China. China is now a major military, military power, and China is also a large economic power. This wouldn't have happened.
Nope.
If people had seen through this deception. And the other thing, the other deception, the fake end of the Soviet Union, that deception worked because now all these right-wingers in the West, they believe Putin is their savior because this is like an extended Operation Trust that was never ended, and all these. And now you have guys like General Flynn, like the old generals that were working with the Romanovs and wanted to be anti-communists. And now you have General Flynn, you have Tucker Carlson, you have Alex Jones, you have all these other people. They believe this conspiracy nonsense, and they believe in Russia now because of this old deception. So it's not a question of was Golitsyn the prophesized chosen one. He gave us information. We can confirm it from all these different angles. We don't have to just take his word for it. The proof is everywhere now.
We have, if we are intimate with the actual historical record and what the defectors said. Look, when I read Golitsyn, I didn't believe it initially in '84 when I read the book. I thought it's interesting, but my thinking was then they couldn't possibly carry out a deception this grand. It wasn't until I was in graduate school, meeting with people who were training to be CIA analysts, that I realized, oh my gosh, these guys would believe this. They would be fooled, because the more I learned, and I'm only in my 20s, the more I learned, the more I realized, and then I read the defector literature and found what Stanislav Bittman had said about a deception, of a liberalizing deception in the Eastern Bloc, and what Jan Shana had said about planning the fake collapse of the Warsaw Pact in his long-range strategy section of his book, We Will Bury You. So then I thought, wait a minute, there's more than one defector saying something very similar. So Golitsyn is really revealing something very deep. And then when you go back to Soviet history about the trust and about controlled opposition and how it works, and infiltrating the right as well as the left, then it starts to congeal for you. You start to say, all right, well, this is how the strategy works. This is how they think. This is how they've organized, and this is what they've accomplished with it. Then you're right. Now there's no excuse for not understanding that, except that you're ignorant and you haven't done the reading.
And we can we can compare this to other historical examples of confirmed deceptions. So, for example, the grand deception operation run by the British, as early as the 1920s, the 1930s and the 1940s. So this was a long-term operation, by Churchill. and the British king and some of these intelligence people, some other aristocrats, they wanted to create the impression that Britain was fundamentally split along certain lines. And they wanted to create the impression that especially the aristocracy was friendly towards fascism. So they would do all this theater over many, many years to lie to the German extreme right wing, lie to the Nazis, and pretend they had sympathies for the Nazis, because that led the Nazis to make some terrible strategic decisions. And so this is just one historical examples where you would, like in the case of the British, you would actually start to promote conspiracy nonsense. You know, when the Protocols of Zion were then published in English in Britain, and this was featured in the press, and Nesta Webster was doing her books, and Churchill basically advocated Nesta Webster's conspiracy books in public and all that stuff, just to make the Nazis believe that Britain was split that way. Now, why wouldn't the communists pretend a split? Not just along the Russia-China line, but also other elements, other countries that were communist. You know, they had multiple fake splits.
They pretended that Romania under Ceausescu was independent, and they pretended that they had disagreements with Gomulka in Poland, where Khrushchev and Gomulka exchanged insults at the airport. You know, they were always doing these things to enhance the nationalist image of certain leaders. Yeah. And I think they would have done a better job with President Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine if they knew what was in store for them in Ukraine. But the thing is, their plans, and I want to emphasize this, their plans don't work out perfectly, because they had this conception. Imagine you have this brilliant deception to collapse the Soviet Union, and you've got agents you've got communist friends in France. You know, you've got Mitterrand in France then, and you've got the corrupt German Chancellor Kohl, who you think is going to play ball, and then you have Bill Clinton coming in as president to replace George H.W. Bush. And as much as they're your friends, they can't commit suicide to help you, because they're living in a country that has a constitution and has independence and has checks and balances. And so and you're you're thinking you're Moscow. Now the world is your oyster. You've collapsed. There's no reason for them to be afraid of you. And then you realize you can't seal the deal, which is what, by the way, what Marshal Sokolovsky said is, the deception is nice. You can get them to get rid of their nuclear arsenal, but you're going to have to nuke them. This is what Marshals Grechko so it's not, so this is where we are now. This is why we're headed towards what appears to be World War III.
You know, I think there's even a mathematical argument to say that the communists absolutely needed those deceptions, these grand deceptions. That's why they spent so much time on it, especially during the 60s. That's why they had to infiltrate anti-communism and try to destroy that. I think it was, because you mentioned this on this show, that communists, the communists very early on contemplated the fake ending of communism, and that this was a very early idea that was developed, just to end communism and then have some sort of a hybrid of ideologies like we see with the Putin regime. And it was clear early on to the communists that the socialist system didn't work. It didn't work. Especially, it didn't work well enough to outdo the West. And so this was the reality for the Soviets. Yeah, this was the earliest. I mean, even in Lenin's era, they had to buy Western technology, and they had to beg, and they had to sell their grain to buy, have the currency to buy Western technology, and they understood that even if they bought Western technology, the West would stay ahead in terms of production, and so socialism didn't work. And this was the reality in Soviet Russia. This was the reality in communist China. So they knew from a mathematical standpoint they needed to abandon communism publicly at some point, because what else were they going to do? The Americans used what's commonly referred to as an offset strategy. So this is outproduce. You live better than the communists, and you outproduce them, and you just cause so many individual problems for them that they may eventually just cave in. Right, or they just refrain
that
from.
Was Eisenhower's. That was Eisenhower's grand strategy.
They would
that
refrain.
He developed.
These communists would ultimately refrain from. They would not do something grand and stupid. This was called an offset strategy. But by deceiving the world about the end of the USSR, and by having China starting to do capitalist things. And by having this fake split between Russia and China, with this deception, that changed the mathematics, that changed the options, and that was the reason why this deception that was so successful is the reason why China nowadays could try its own offset strategy against America by isolating America, taking away America's allies and America's trading partners, just to knock off all these dominoes until America is isolated, and the offset is so great that America would lose a larger war.
Yeah, and what Mr. Wang has said to me is that is where they're headed. And of course, next week we're going to talk about the Sino-Soviet split, and we're going to carry it on from what we talked about the 60s. What's evolving is this idea that China is ripe to switch sides, and we're going to talk about the conspiracy and death of Lin Biao and Kissinger's trips to China and Nixon's shaking hands with it and where they go from there. So we've gone about 3 hours now, and it's been very intense. I want to thank Alex. It's been really interesting. I think that we covered so much vital, because the 60s is the decisive decade in the Cold War. And these turning point events like the Kennedy assassination, the Galitzin defection, and now the rise of Kissinger and the China thing. And of course, so next week, come back and watch our bit on the Sino-Soviet split and the conspiracy and death of Lin Biao. I'm Jeff Nyquist. This has been Friends and Enemies, and with my co-host Alex Benesch in Germany. Thanks for being with us.